I am excited to talk to you all today about our new structured grant that we are piloting at the Minnesota Historical Society Legacy Grants. It is a structured grant called Create a Disaster Response Kit, and it's brand new, and I'm going to tell you all about it. First off, I'll just introduce myself quickly. My name is Megan Narvey. I am the Outreach Conservator at the Minnesota Historical Society. So I provide assistance to collections or individuals who are trying to do collections care and conservation projects. And I also review grant applications that are based in conservation and collections care. Here's a bit of what I'm going to talk about today. Starting off with what is a disaster response kit, then the difference and connection between disaster plans and disaster response kits, what a disaster response kit contains, a little bit about what a structured grant is, and then some information about the application process and what happens during the grant. So what is a disaster response kit? This is a collection of tools, equipment, and other materials that is set aside specifically to use in a collections emergency. A collections emergency can be all sorts of different things, but probably most frequently in a museum setting, it's a water-based emergency, whether that is a flood or a leak or something else. The disaster response kit can be either fixed or it could be mobile. So it can be stored in one specific location in the museum, or it can be somewhat transportable or wheeled so that it can be moved around as needed. You can have a disaster response kit that is individual to a certain museum or organization. You could also have a disaster response kit that is shared between multiple organizations in a region, so that many different people would have access to the kit and there would be a shared responsibility to maintain it. The contents of a disaster response kit need to be specific to the needs of the organization. So if you only have archives and you don't have any 3D collections, then there are certain types of emergency response supplies that you're just not going to need. On the other hand, if you have a really small collection, then you might need less stuff than if you have a really large collection. There are lots of different ways that it can be individualized. But importantly, the disaster response kit includes only enough supplies to form the beginning of an emergency response. So if it's a really small emergency, like it's a small leak and only a few items are affected, then your collections emergency response kit will probably be able to take care of everything. But in larger emergencies that require lots of different supplies and multiple days of work to remedy, the disaster response kit is mostly there so that you can get an immediate start, and then in the meantime, you can order or go purchase more supplies. And another note that I have here is that a disaster response kit must be regularly inventoried and expired items replaced. So even if you don't use your emergency response kit, you still need to regularly go through it and make sure that everything is there, because sometimes people might use something from the emergency response kit and then not replace it, and you don't know that until you have an emergency. And also lots of things expire, like batteries and nitrile gloves and other types of things that you might find in the emergency response kit. So even if you're not using it, it's an ongoing process of keeping it going. The purpose of a collections disaster plan is to improve an organization's preparedness to respond to potential emergencies, including fire, water damage, major storms, and more. So a disaster plan is a precursor to having a disaster response kit. because the disaster plan includes a risk assessment and a description of the specific organizational needs, which will be used to develop the disaster response kit. So you don't have to guess at what sort of things you need to be prepared for and what sort of things you're going to need in order to respond, because the disaster plan will include all of that information already. And for this reason, a completed and recently updated disaster plan is a required document for disaster response kit grant applications. And if you don't have a disaster plan, that is also an available structured grant through the Legacy Grants program. And I am happy to talk more about that if you have more questions. Here, I have listed out the typical contents of a disaster plan. So there's a list of types of events to be prepared for and the scope. So you're not likely to get a huge flood, but maybe you'll get like a minor flood depending on like what your location is. There will be contact information and personnel information, procedures to follow, including specific treatment procedures for damaged collections, which will be customized to the type of collection that you have. There'd be a map of the building, and there will be a list of supplies and equipment on hand along with their locations, and also a list of vendors who could provide supplies and equipment as needed to assist in the response and recovery. So all of this information is obviously super helpful if you ever find yourself in an emergency situation, and you can also use it to develop your disaster response kit. So what would a disaster response kit contain? I first want to point out that just a couple of months ago, Connecting to Collections Care hosted a free webinar on collections emergency kits where they gave lots of information about what kind of things you should keep in your emergency kit, and you can watch it for free online. It's another great resource when you're thinking about acquiring one of these. So, disaster response kit normally contains a container, of course, whatever you're going to put all of this stuff in. It would also require documentation, instructional documents, personal safety tools, scene and environmental control materials, collection salvage materials, and other tools. I'll go through each of these and explain a little bit more about what these sorts of things are. So your container, this could be a bunch of different things. It could be a backpack. It could be a wheeled crate, a plastic storage bin, milk crates. You can see in the top picture on the left that they have their emergency supply kit at one of the Smithsonian museums in a mobile trash can. And then there's another example of it inside like a plastic box, like archival storage box. But I've also included a couple examples of you can get like a cabinet with wheels on it or a cart, or you could just have them on shelves in a closet. There are lots of ways to store them, and there's not necessarily one better way. It depends on your space. Documentation supplies. This could include name tags for people when they're responding to the emergency, because you might have lots of different people coming in to help. It can include notepads and clipboards, mechanical pencils, or other kinds of pens and pencils, a tape measure, tie-on labels, adhesive labels, not for artifacts, but for boxes, and a disposable camera, although this is kind of old school. Now everybody has cameras on their phone, so disposable cameras are maybe a little bit less important than they once were to document how the process is going and what the disaster looks like. Instructional documents include one of my absolute favorites, the emergency salvage wheel, which you can see pictured here. You also might want to include in your kit a copy of your disaster plan, floor plans for your space. You can include gallery case access guides so that you can easily get in, or somebody who has no experience accessing the gallery cases can easily get into them, like a firefighter or something. You might want to include priority object locations. Again, all of these things would probably be in your disaster plan already. And other things that are suggested have been loan agreements and object damage reports, which would be blank reports that you would fill in as you work on salvaging the collection. Personal safety tools are very important to have on hand, and some of these will expire over time, so you do need to keep them up to date. So things like safety goggles, disposable aprons, hard hats, hand sanitizer, and disinfectant wipes, important in the era of COVID-19. Reusable respirators or N95 masks are important not just for coronavirus, but also if there's something hazardous that is released during the disaster, or if there's a mold issue that is discovered. First aid kit, nitrile gloves, work gloves, and drinking water. You could also include snacks, although I think that those might need to be replaced rather frequently. Scene and environmental controls include a temperature and relative humidity spot checker, and you can definitely purchase digital ones, but I am always a big fan of the analog hygrometers, which you can see here, and I like them because they don't require batteries, and they're very easy to maintain and to calibrate so that they're always accurate, and they're nice and small. So just a small pitch for the old school hygrometer. Other types of environmental controls you might have in your kit include polyethylene sheeting, garbage bags, duct tape, caution tape, a mop, and a bucket, door wedges to keep doors propped open, fire extinguisher, hopefully you have those located around your museum anyway, walkie-talkies, headlamps, and work lights, and then you have extra supplies like batteries and light bulbs and stuff like that. For collection salvage, and this refers to when you're working on objects in the collection that have been damaged in an emergency. For example, if you have an exhibit case that got wet. So these sorts of tools would be used in that situation, including polyethylene zip top bags, cotton string or nylon monofilament string, plastic wash tubs and trays, all sorts of different things that absorb water, like paper towels and cotton rags, and unprinted newspaper and white cotton terry cloth are all examples of things that absorb water. There are other things as well that people use. Wax paper, freezer paper, remate, and mylar are all good for lining and separating things that are wet. Corrugated plastic board and screens are great for carrying things that are wet. Clothespins and plastic clips, clean brushes, and wood blocks or similar for stacking and propping things off the ground. So these are all examples of things that you might have in your emergency kit related to salvaging a collection. And then in my list of other tools, I have just a variety of different things that you might find useful in an emergency, which are all good to have on hand. A wrench, screwdrivers, hatchet, utility knife. I've heard that a utility knife is particularly useful. Rope, cable ties, scissors, crowbar, flashlight, again with batteries that you would need to regularly replace, and a waterproof extension cord or power strip. And I've included a picture here. There are response kits that can be purchased from archival suppliers. This is an example of one from Gaylord Archival Supplier. And it has a variety of different things that you would typically find in an emergency kit, but it's quite small and portable, and it doesn't have everything that I've listed here, but it is still a good option for a couple of $100s. I've also included a maybe section. So these are sort of larger purchases, which you could argue would be great to have on hand in terms of an emergency, especially if it's an emergency kit that's being shared between several organizations. A wet vac, large industrial fans, dehumidifier, a portable generator, and folding tables are all other things. May take up a little bit more space, but they could still be useful in an emergency. So here's a bit more information about structured grants. So what I'm talking about, these grants are appropriated from the Legacy Amendment. We have a certain amount of funding from the Legacy Amendment that we distribute under the Minnesota Historical and Cultural Heritage Grants. The eligibility includes 501c3 nonprofits, units of state and local government, federally recognized tribes, and educational institutions. If you have never applied for a grant before, the first step is to request an account on the grants portal, which I have linked here. Structured grants, so the type of grant I'm talking about today are small grants under $10,000, and we have 4 deadlines a year for these grant sizes, including one that we just passed in last week. The next one will be in October. And we also have a grants open house on the first Thursday of every month, which is a useful way for you to get in touch with grant staff to talk more about your project or if you have any questions. So here is a little bit more information about preparing your application.
Megan, we have a request to go back to a slide.
Okay.
Oh, okay. So Celeste is asking, can we see the kit slide again or get printouts of the slideshow, please?
I am happy to send out copies of the slideshow. So I'll have my contact information at the end of the presentation. And if you send me an email, I will send you a PDF. All right. So before you apply for your grant, you should definitely read the grants manual. You should get yourself set up on the grants portal, like I just said, and figure out what your next application deadline would be. And then you would want to start a structured grant application. So this is a specific type of small grant called a structured grant, which has a shorter application form because it's a standard type of project. So you're always going to have similar budget, similar outcomes, similar goals in a structured grant, which is why it has a shorter application form. The eligible grant expenses for this structured grant are acquire tools, equipment, and supplies needed to create the disaster response kit. If the total project costs are above $5,000, then you have to meet the procurement requirements of the state, which includes an informal, competitively based process soliciting a minimum of 3 verbal quotes for any materials necessary to complete the project. So that's one thing to keep in mind if your project is over $5,000. You will want to attach a list of the tools, equipment, and supplies that you intend to purchase with your grant application. And then when everything is filled out and all of your attachments are present, you just need to submit your application before the deadline. To prepare your budget, you need to assess the cost of supplies needed to establish a disaster response kit based on your responses to these questions. What materials in the collection are most at risk in an emergency situation? Which emergencies are the most important to prepare for based on their potential impact or likelihood of occurrence? What quantity of supplies would be needed to fully respond to a small emergency or to adequately respond to a larger emergency until more supplies can be purchased or shipped? You would include a list of possible vendors that can supply these materials. And then if you have, again, a project over $5,000, you would want to describe the process used for open procurement or choosing a vendor that will be documented and kept in your files. Once you've created your list of possible vendors and your list of supplies that you're going to want to purchase, then you're pretty much ready to submit your structured grant application. How to find supplies. Here's a list of different supply stores that you might be looking at when you're looking at acquiring emergency kit supplies. And the answer is any kind of store. So art supply stores are great for finding brushes, small hand tools like spatulas, things like a grease pencil or other pencils and markers. Hardware stores obviously are excellent for lots of different kinds of tools, including mops, extension cords, fans, plastic sheetings, garbage bags, cotton rags, portable tables, any kind of tool. You can look to safety equipment suppliers, which are specific companies, for safety supplies like your gloves, goggles, masks, that sort of thing. Office supply stores are also great for different salvage materials like unprinted newsprint or bubble wrap. You can also look at archival supply stores for specific conservation tools like blotting paper, environmental monitoring equipment, mylar, remay, or soot sponges. Fabric stores, you could find different kinds of fabric like cheesecloth and terry cloth that are often included in emergency kits. And of course, general supply stores like a Target, like a dollar store for things like freezer and wax paper, paper towels, and disinfectant. So what sort of information should you include in your application? You would probably need to start by describing your organization so I get a sense of what type of collection you have and what sort of events are you preparing for. You probably want to include some information about why this project supports the preservation of Minnesota's history, because this is the purpose of this type of grant. What are the biggest risks to your collection that you want to prepare for? You might be able to pull that directly from your disaster plan. What are the most vulnerable parts of your collection? So think about like archives, photographs, textiles, things that are really sensitive to extreme changes in environment or getting wet or getting burnt. Some things like fossil collections, they're pretty stable. Rocks, metal, they're less vulnerable than other parts of your collection. But you could also think about it like, which parts of my collection are most important for me to protect, like loaned items in your collection, or like the most historically valuable. Your application should include information about how you determine the number and type of supplies to purchase, which again, you might be able to find in your disaster plan. If you have any questions about what to include in your application, please get in touch. I'm happy to help. So after you submit your application before the deadline, your application is then reviewed by grant administrators and a grant content reviewer. If the application is considered ineligible for various reasons, it will be returned with comments on how to improve it for resubmission. So it's not a no necessarily. It's let's work on this and try again. Applications that are selected for funding will be recommended to the Minnesota Historical Society's Executive Council for approval, and that you'll find out about the approval of the grant about 8 weeks after your application deadline. After you're awarded the grant, you need to sign a grant agreement with the grants administration staff, which will include any milestones or conditions that you have to do and the deadlines. Standard milestones for this grant would be a grant agreement and a final report, although more milestones might be possible based on your unique situation. Every milestone takes 30 days to review. You have 1 year to finish the project and 1 month after the project is completed to submit the final report. So in this case, it seems like probably you have plenty of time to finish this project. It should not take you a full year to acquire all of these supplies. For the final report, we'd want to see photos and documentation showing the materials and equipment that you've purchased and the location of the kit in your museum, so you can take pictures showing it. You'd also want to provide an updated disaster plan or a disaster plan addendum that describes the location and inventory of the disaster kit and includes the schedule and responsibility for maintenance. So this is for our benefit, it's also for your benefit, because it's very easy to set up a disaster kit and then not pay attention to it, and then you come back to it in an emergency 5 years later and you realize that it's not actually useful for you. And hopefully by including this information right away, right at the start, you'll be able to keep on top of it and keep your disaster kit useful for you. So how can you make sure that this is a success? disaster response kits require upkeep and maintenance. I've said that a few times, so I'm going to say it again because it's something that everyone struggles with. Disaster response kits are so helpful, but they're important to keep on top of. It's not uncommon for people to go into disaster response kits like you just need a pair of scissors really fast and you know that there are scissors in the disaster response kit. That happens, but if you don't regularly inventory and make sure that the scissors are there, then when you have an emergency, maybe the scissors are gone and you don't know where they are. So that's not helpful. Also, like I've said, parts of the kit expire. So nitrile gloves, for example, expire after a few years. First aid kits expire, batteries. So you don't want to be in a situation where you need an emergency. You have an emergency and the supplies that you have aren't going to work. And it might feel wasteful to have nitrile gloves in your emergency kit that you just have to throw out after a few years, but the purpose of them is still being fulfilled because they're being there in case you need them. Kits need to be regularly inventoried, like I said, to ensure that everything is there and that everything has not been expired. Many of the materials in a disaster kit are consumables and need to be replaced after use. So this grant funds the startup costs of making a disaster response kit. But if you have an emergency, you're going to use the paper towels and the nitrile gloves and all of that stuff, and then they're not going to be in your disaster kit anymore. And you can't apply for another grant to refill the disaster response kit after an emergency. It should be part of the organization's budget to keep the kit sustainable over the long term. So when you need to replace supplies, either like a couple of supplies because things are expiring or a lot of supplies because you used everything, then it's important to think about how you're going to accomplish that. There are things in your disaster response kit that aren't consumable and that you're going to be able to use over and over again. But lots of them you're going to use, and that's their purpose. Here I've included some resources that you can look at. Again, if you're interested in clicking these links, I'll send you the PDF if you send me an email. Here's my contact information. Now, let me know if you have any questions.
Let's see. So Julia's got a question.
Thank you, Julia.
Well, I'll read it. Do organizations usually have disaster kits, or is this a newer recommendation? Do you think every historical society should have a disaster kit, or there should be regional ones?
Good question. It's not necessarily a newer recommendation, but it's often a lower priority because there are lots of organizations that still don't even have disaster plans, and disaster plans are really the first step. Disaster kits are useful and important in responding to emergencies, but it depends on your capacity and your space to include that sort of stuff, especially like a bigger disaster kit might take up a lot more space. So I think that every historical society should have at least a small disaster kit, and it would be great if there were larger disaster kits that included things like a shop vac and dehumidifier and generator that could be shared regionally. But that requires a lot of cooperation and planning. Yes, Celeste. I also think that Minnesota Alliance of Local History Museums is starting to build capacity for mutual assistance, which is great.
And sort of a question I would have is, people who are doing, conservators who are writing disaster plans, thinking about what's been going on in Oregon this month, I wonder, are they trying to think about what might be happening in the future with global warming and how it's affecting local areas?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that often emergency response plans think a little bit about what the future might look like, but not a lot about what the future will look like.
Yeah.
And partially that's because it's hard to guess. There are more and more resources out there talking about how museums and collections can prepare for climate change and the different weather events that are going to start happening more and more frequently. But
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to be broad in responding to that question because every place is going to have slightly different needs. Even in Minnesota, there's going to be places that are going to have more floods and places that are going to have more tornadoes, or places that are just going to be hotter.
Right. And it seems like it'll always be good to plan for floods, at least minor ones in Minnesota.
Right. It seems like I don't know that this is true necessarily. I'm not a climate expert, but it seems like usually it's an increased frequency of a type of event that you already experience, right? So like if you occasionally get floods, maybe you're getting more floods, or if you occasionally have hot snaps, maybe you're getting longer hot snaps.
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably sometimes you're getting things that you would have never experienced before, but like we're not going to have to prepare for a hurricane, so at least we have that.
That's right. Yeah, that helps me sleep at night.
It reminds me that before the pandemic and everyone was sent home, I had learned that there was a state climatologist and in the state of Minnesota, and I really wanted to get in contact with them to talk more about what the future of Minnesota's climate is going to be like and how that will affect collections in Minnesota. And I should look into that again because that seems like it would be really interesting.
Yeah.
Celeste asked a question. Could we say this is for, among other things, storm damage, which could include tornadoes, windstorms, and blizzards, or should they be listed separately? I think that you could list them under storm damage and not have to list them separately, but it depends on how they are described in your disaster plan. They might be all considered separately in your disaster plan, but if they all require the same sorts of supplies, then that's also okay. Especially tornadoes and windstorms, those seem very similar. Blizzards might have their own kinds of issues with maybe you need to include a shovel in your disaster kit. Great. Thanks for the question. A lot of the organizations and people who are really ahead of things in terms of disaster preparedness and disaster response kits, that sort of information, are people on the coasts who are dealing with hurricanes regularly, or like wildfires regularly. And I feel like in the Midwest, we're a little bit behind maybe because we don't have like these regular disastrous events that are happening all the time. We still have things that we need to prepare for, but we might have different things that we need to prepare for than the information that's been published before. I don't see a lot of webinars out there talking about preparing for blizzards.
Yeah. So it could be the way to go with your next webinar.